The billionaire Grant Whitmore once scorned the black waitress Naomi Clark after their secret affair, but when she storms back into his boardroom 4 years later, now a celebrated lawyer, brandishing their still-valid marriage license and flanked by their bright-eyed twin boys, his perfect world teeters on the brink of scandal. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel, and let's get started. Manhattan, winter of 2008. The frigid air sliced against Naomi Clark's face as she hurried into the Moonlight Lounge, adjusting her black and white uniform before starting another shift as a waitress. Her fingers, chapped from the cold, fumbled with the buttons of her crisp white shirt. At 23, the young black woman from Baltimore divided her time between 2 jobs and law school at New York University, where she'd secured a partial scholarship after years of academic excellence. "You're cutting it close tonight, Clark," her manager said, eyeing the antique clock above the bar. "Sorry, Ted." "The subway was delayed again," Naomi replied, tying her apron with practiced efficiency. She didn't mention the 3 hours of contract law she'd just endured or the essay waiting for her attention back in her tiny Bronx apartment. The Moonlight Lounge catered to Manhattan's elite, a place where old money mingled with new tech wealth over rare vintages and 20-year-old scotch. Most waitstaff lasted weeks before the demanding clientele and meager tips drove them away. Naomi had endured for nearly 2 years, memorizing wine lists and customer preferences to maximize her earnings. It was during a particularly hectic Wednesday evening that Grant Whitmore entered her life. The heir to Whitmore Holdings, a real estate empire valued in the billions, strode in with the confidence of someone who had never heard the word no. Tall, with perfectly styled blonde hair and light green eyes that seemed to appraise everything as potential acquisitions, he was the embodiment of Manhattan's white elite privilege. Naomi's section filled quickly, but Ted personally escorted Grant to one of her tables. "Our finest table for Mr. Whitmore," Ted announced with a deferential nod. "Naomi will take excellent care of you tonight." Grant barely acknowledged her presence as he settled into his chair, immediately checking his phone. When he finally looked up, his gaze swept over her with clinical detachment. "I'll have a bottle of Chateau Margaux, 1982, he stated rather than requested. Without missing a beat, Naomi replied, "An excellent choice, sir. Would you prefer it served at 65 degrees, as is traditional, or slightly cooler at 62? Some connoisseurs prefer the latter to appreciate the full complexity of that particular vintage." Grant's eyes narrowed, reassessing her. "You understand wines?" "I studied on my own," she answered simply, holding his gaze with quiet confidence. Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps even a hint of respect. 62 degrees, then. When she returned with the perfectly tempered wine, he was alone, his business associates apparently dismissed. As she poured the first glass, he asked, "Where does a waitress learn about wine temperature preferences?" "The same place anyone learns anything, Mr. Whitmore, books and practice," Naomi responded, her tone professional but with an edge that made clear she noticed his condescension. He smiled, seemingly intrigued rather than offended. "Join me for a glass." "I'm working, sir. After your shift, then." It wasn't a question. That initial conversation transformed into a series of clandestine meetings, always far from the spotlight and Grant's social circle. For the world, he remained the billionaire playboy appearing in tabloids alongside socialites. For Naomi, he became the man who took her to private dinners and engaged in conversations about literature until dawn. Their affair burned with intensity behind closed doors. In his private penthouse, Grant showed a different side, attentive, almost vulnerable. But Naomi couldn't help noticing he never took her to the restaurants he frequented with friends, never introduced her to anyone in his world. "Why do we always meet in private?" she asked one evening, 6 months into their relationship, as they shared a bottle of wine in his rarely used Tribeca apartment. "It's to protect you from the press," he explained, tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. They'd tear into your private life, your past. Trust me, I'm doing you a favor. But Naomi began to understand the real reasons when she noticed his uncomfortable glances whenever someone he knew spotted them together in public. The way he'd introduce her vaguely as a friend, or sometimes my legal consultant, referencing her law studies rather than acknowledge their relationship. Late March brought uncharacteristic warmth to the city, along with the sickening realization that had Naomi rushing to a pharmacy during her lunch break. 2 missed periods, morning nausea that forced her to reschedule classes. The pregnancy test confirmed what her body had been signaling for weeks. That evening, in a suite at the Four Seasons where Grant was celebrating his acquisition of a historic skyscraper, Naomi gathered her courage. They'd just made love, his self-satisfied smile still playing on his lips as he poured himself a whiskey. "Grant," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I need to tell you something important." He raised an eyebrow, still riding the high of his business victory. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant," she said, watching his face carefully, trying to decipher the expression that instantly hardened his features. The silence lasted only seconds before a cold laugh echoed through the room. "You really think I'll fall for that? How many women have tried this same trick before?" "This isn't a trick. It's our child," Naomi responded, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain calm. The transformation in his gaze was terrifying. The eyes that once looked at her with desire now analyzed her with disdain. "You're just a black girl from a poor neighborhood. Do you honestly think you can be part of my world? That you can use a child to infiltrate the Whitmore family?" The words hit Naomi like physical blows. Grant continued, merciless. "My family built half of Manhattan. You serve tables and live in a tiny apartment in the Bronx. Be realistic." "I'm not asking to be part of your family," she managed, tears threatening to spill. "I'm just telling you about your child." "If there even is a child," he sneered, standing to pour another drink. "And if there is, we both know it's not what either of us wants." The next morning, Grant summoned her to a meeting at the Whitmore Holdings office. Naomi arrived hoping for a chance at dialogue, that perhaps he had reconsidered after the shock wore off. Instead, she found 2 corporate lawyers and Grant himself, who didn't even raise his eyes from his documents when she entered. "Sign this and disappear. You never meant anything beyond temporary entertainment," he declared coldly, sliding a confidentiality agreement across the table. "It's $100,000, enough to solve your problem. Nobody needs to know." "I won't abort our child, Grant," she answered, tears blurring her vision. "Then raise this child alone, but sign the damn paperwork, or you'll see what Whitmore Holdings is capable of. One phone call from me, and you won't find employment even as a cleaner in New York." When Naomi hesitated, he ordered security to escort her out. In the crowded lobby, he grabbed her arm and whispered loud enough for his associates to hear, "You're an unwanted stain on my immaculate reputation. Get out of my life." 1 week later, in a public prenatal clinic, Naomi received the news. Twins. Alone in the small ultrasound room, she contemplated the 2 pulsing dots on the screen as the technician pointed, "See? 2 strong heartbeats." That same night, she saw Grant on television announcing his engagement to Catherine Hartwell, heiress to a banking dynasty from Boston. The couple smiled at the Metropolitan Museum, surrounded by New York high society, while Naomi sold her few pieces of jewelry to buy prenatal vitamins. 2 weeks later, she was fired from the Moonlight Lounge. "Orders from above," the embarrassed manager explained. The same happened at her second job. In 1 month, she exhausted her savings paying rent. In 2, she had to suspend her law school enrollment, unable to pay the remaining tuition. It was on a particularly cold night while looking for employment for the 5th time that week that Naomi saw Grant and his fiancée exiting a boutique on 5th Avenue. Catherine was sporting a diamond ring that certainly cost more than everything Naomi had ever owned. Hidden among passers-by, She observed the man who had abandoned her continue his perfect life while she struggled to keep a roof over her head and food in the refrigerator. That night, in her Bronx apartment, after a failed job interview where the manager had insinuated favors in exchange for the position, Naomi looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror while caressing her growing belly. "You won't need him," she swore to the children she carried. "One day we'll be the ones looking down at him. One day he'll regret every word he said." The next day, Naomi found the check still untouched in her drawer. Against all her principles, she deposited it. Not to get rid of the babies, as Grant had suggested, but to save them. With the money, she paid 6 months' rent in advance and enrolled in a paralegal technical course she could complete before giving birth. "One day you'll look at me and won't recognize me, neither in my face nor in the power I'll hold," she promised, meticulously mapping out a plan of study and work for the coming years. The abandonment that should have broken her had just forged the first link in a chain that would one day strangle Grant Whitmore's empire. As she caressed her growing belly, Naomi couldn't imagine that 15 years later, she would be the one looking down at Grant from above, with an empire built on the ruins of the cruel words he had directed at her that night. The morning light slipped through threadbare curtains as Naomi folded the check and tucked it into her wallet. The irony wasn't lost on her. Grant's attempt to erase his child would instead ensure their survival. Her hands trembled slightly, a mixture of anger and resolve coursing through her veins. She placed her palm against her still flat belly, the twins merely a whisper beneath her skin. "We'll make it," she promised them. Somehow. The final months of pregnancy proved a monumental challenge. With 6 months' rent secured from Grant's money, Naomi enrolled in her paralegal course, attending morning classes at a community college in the Bronx. The program wasn't prestigious, but it was practical, skills she could use immediately after the babies arrived. Finding employment while visibly pregnant became an exercise in humiliation. Each interview followed a similar pattern: initial interest in her resume, followed by poorly concealed dismay when she entered the room, her growing belly announcing itself before she could. "Your qualifications are impressive," said a manager at a small law firm, his eyes never quite meeting hers, instead darting repeatedly to her stomach. "But we need someone long-term, no interruptions." Another interviewer was more direct. "We can't have employees needing leave right after being hired," she said flatly. "Try again after your situation resolves." The worst interview came at a downtown restaurant. The owner, a middle-aged man with wandering eyes, leaned across his desk. "I might make an exception for you," he said, his voice dropping, "if you're flexible about certain arrangements." Naomi stood immediately, knocking her chair backward. "I'm looking for employment, not exploitation," she snapped, walking out while he called after her. "Good luck finding work in your condition. You're not exactly a hot commodity right now." Back in her apartment, Naomi spread her finances across her kitchen table, a wobbly piece of furniture she'd found discarded on the street. She separated coins into labeled jars: food, transportation, school supplies. The baby essentials jar remained frustratingly empty. Each penny required strategic allocation: prenatal vitamins or bus fare, healthy food or warmer clothes as her regular ones no longer fit. The winter grew harsher. Her apartment's heating system worked sporadically at best. Naomi studied wrapped in multiple layers, wearing fingerless gloves as she highlighted textbooks and took meticulous notes. The paramedic training was demanding, requiring memorization of complex legal terminology and procedures. She often worked until her eyes burned, falling asleep with books spread across her bed. "This is temporary," she whispered to herself during particularly difficult nights, when the babies seemed to be practicing soccer against her ribs and sleep was impossible. "We won't live like this forever." Her refrigerator grew increasingly bare. Pride had initially kept her from seeking assistance, but at 7 months pregnant, carrying twins, and constantly lightheaded from hunger, Naomi finally visited a community soup kitchen, The first time, she kept her head down, shame burning her cheeks as she accepted a bowl of stew and day-old bread. "First time here?" asked an elderly black woman serving food. When Naomi nodded silently, the woman added an extra roll to her tray. "Eat for those babies. No shame in getting help when you need it." The judgment came from others. Sidelong glances at her pregnant belly, no wedding ring in sight. One afternoon, a woman roughly her mother's age muttered loudly enough for Naomi to hear, "Girls these days have no morals, having babies they can't afford." Naomi straightened her spine, meeting the woman's gaze directly. "You know nothing about my life," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the hurt. She finished her meal and left, determined not to return to that particular kitchen. At a church donation center, she collected second-hand baby clothes, carefully inspecting each tiny garment before adding it to her bag. She washed everything twice when she got home, hanging onesies and tiny socks to dry on a makeshift clothesline strung across her bathroom. One bitterly cold January morning, Naomi faced a brutal decision. Use her dwindling funds for the textbook required for her next course module, or buy the prenatal vitamins her doctor had emphasized were crucial for the twins' development. Standing in the pharmacy, she stared at the vitamin bottle, its price tag nearly matching her food budget for the week. She chose the vitamins. That night, she photocopied relevant textbook pages at the public library, 10 cents per page carefully counted from her transportation jar. She'd walk to class tomorrow instead. The walk proved too ambitious. 8 months pregnant with twins, Naomi made it only halfway before dizziness overtook her. The sidewalk tilted dangerously as she clutched a lamppost for support, her vision darkening around the edges. "Dios mío, are you okay, mamita?" Small but strong hands gripped her elbow. Naomi blinked to find an elderly Puerto Rican woman peering at her with concern, already guiding her toward a nearby building. "I'm fine," Naomi protested weakly. "Just needed a moment." "You need more than a moment. You need food and rest," the woman insisted, introducing herself as Rosa Vega as she practically pushed Naomi up the steps to her first-floor apartment. Rosa's tiny kitchen smelled of sofrito and warmth. Before Naomi could object, a plate of rice, beans, and stewed chicken appeared before her, along with a stern order to eat every bite. "You're not eating enough," Rosa declared, watching as Naomi's initial polite resistance crumbled at the first mouthful. "Those babies need strength, and so do you." Between bites, Naomi's story tumbled out. Law school, the pregnancy, Grant's rejection, her struggles to prepare for the twins' arrival while completing her studies. Rosa listened without interruption, her expression softening with each detail. When Naomi finished both her story and the plate of food, Rosa filled it again. "When I came here from San Juan, I had nothing," Rosa said. "My husband died on the boat. I raised 3 children alone in this same building. It's not easy, but it's possible." As Naomi prepared to leave, Rosa made an unexpected offer. "When the babies come, bring them to me. I'll watch them while you study and work. I can't ask you to—" "You didn't ask. I offered." Rosa cut her off. "My grandchildren are grown. My apartment is too quiet. We help each other. That's how we survive." That night, in her cold apartment, Naomi reorganized her small bedroom to accommodate the donated crib she'd received from a community center. She washed and folded tiny clothes, arranging them in cardboard boxes labeled in her neat handwriting. Despite the threadbare conditions, she created a space of order and care. "Your dad may have millions," she told her belly, "but you'll have something worth more. You'll have love and purpose." 2 weeks later, during a particularly dense lecture on litigation procedures, Naomi felt the first contraction. She ignored it, focusing on taking notes, unwilling to miss crucial information. When a second, stronger pain followed 15 minutes later, she reluctantly packed her notebook. By the time she reached the hospital, the contractions were 5 minutes apart. The admissions nurse looked at her insurance card, a basic public assistance plan, and directed her to wait in the general area. Rosa, whom Naomi had called in panic, arrived 30 minutes later, immediately advocating for her with rapid-fire Spanish and unwavering insistence. "This girl is having twins! She needs attention now, not when you decide it's convenient." The delivery was difficult. 30 hours of labor ending in an emergency C-section when one twin showed signs of distress. Through it all, Rosa remained, holding Naomi's hand, wiping her forehead, speaking words of encouragement when Naomi's strength faltered. "You're the strongest woman I know," Rosa whispered as doctors rushed around them. "These babies are lucky to have you." When Malcolm and Marcus finally arrived, tiny but perfect, with identical scrunched faces and surprisingly strong grips, Naomi felt an overwhelming surge of love and determination unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Holding them in the recovery room, exhausted beyond measure but filled with a fierce new purpose, she made them a solemn promise. "Everything I do from this moment forward is for you. We may start with nothing, but watch what we'll build together." While cradling her newborn twins in the public hospital in the Bronx, Naomi couldn't imagine that one day they would be in a presidential suite at the Four Seasons, the very hotel where their father had rejected them, discussing with presidents of elite universities who were begging for their enrollment. The twins came home to Naomi's tiny Bronx apartment 5 days after their birth. As she stepped through the door with Malcolm and Marcus bundled against her chest, the reality of single motherhood crashed over her like a wave. The cozy nest she'd prepared suddenly looked impossibly small, the silence now filled with the responsibility of 2 entirely dependent lives. "Welcome home, my loves," she whispered, her voice catching as she placed them carefully in the second-hand crib Rosa had helped her set up. The twins, identical except for the small birthmark on Malcolm's ankle, slept peacefully, unaware of the challenges their tiny family faced. That first night set the pattern for the years to come. When Malcolm woke crying at 2 in the morning, Marcus joined seconds later, their wails harmonizing in hungry desperation. Naomi, still recovering from her C-section, moved mechanically between the crib and the rocking chair, feeding one baby while soothing the other with gentle touches and soft songs. By 3:30, both boys were finally quiet. Naomi, instead of returning to bed, pulled her paralegal textbooks onto her lap, flipping to the chapter on contract law she needed to master before her final exam the following week. Tears of exhaustion slid silently down her cheeks as she highlighted key passages, determination overriding her body's desperate need for rest. "We'll get through this," she promised the sleeping infants. "This is temporary." Rosa proved invaluable in those early months. The elderly woman appeared each morning at 7, shooing Naomi out the door to her classes while taking charge of the twins with grandmother's efficiency. "They are good boys," Rosa would report when Naomi returned, sometimes bearing small offerings, a pot of rice and beans, a hand-knitted baby cap. Strong like their mama. The apartment transformed completely to accommodate its newest residents. The small living room now housed the twins' crib and a changing table fashioned from an old dresser. Diapers hung drying in the bathroom, saving the precious quarters needed for the laundromat. Books and papers were stacked strategically between baby bottles and formula cans, every inch of space serving multiple purposes. When Naomi received her paralegal certificate 6 months after the twins' birth, Rosa stood in the audience holding the chubby 6-month-olds, who waved their arms as if applauding when their mother's name was called. "Look at your mama," Rosa whispered to them, pride evident in her voice. "She is going to change the world." Job hunting proved slightly easier with her new credentials, though still challenging for a single mother of infant twins. After a dozen rejections, Naomi finally secured an interview at a small law firm in the Bronx, specializing in immigration and tenant rights. The owner, Salvador Morales, was an aging attorney with kind eyes and a pragmatic approach. "I need someone who can organize files, draft basic documents, and occasionally translate for Spanish-speaking clients," he explained, glancing at her resume. "Your qualifications are excellent, but I see you have young children." Naomi straightened her spine, prepared for another rejection. Yes, twin boys, 6 months old. Instead of dismissing her, Mr. Morales nodded thoughtfully. My daughter raised 3 children alone while working here. I understand the challenges. The pay isn't much, but the hours are flexible and you can bring the boys if your childcare falls through. The salary was indeed modest, barely covering rent and essentials, but the opportunity was priceless. Naomi started the following Monday, arranging her desk with meticulous care and a small framed photo of Malcolm and Marcus. Life settled into an exhausting rhythm. Mornings began at 5, preparing bottles and dressing the twins before Rosa arrived. Days at the law office were spent learning the practical aspects of legal work, filing systems, document preparation, client intake, while evenings were dedicated to the twins. After their 8 o'clock bedtime, Naomi spread her law school application materials across the kitchen table, determined to eventually complete the degree she'd been forced to abandon. The rare moments of sleep were often interrupted. When Marcus developed colic at 7 months, Naomi walked the floor with him for hours, soothing his cries while trying not to wake Malcolm. On nights when both boys were sick, she moved the rocking chair between the crib and the bathroom, alternating between comforting one twin and holding the other over the toilet as he vomited. Despite the exhaustion, Naomi maintained a disciplined financial system. Each paycheck was meticulously divided. Rent, utilities, food, baby necessities, and a small future fund. A porcelain piggy bank decorated with Harvard 2030 in careful lettering. Some weeks, the future fund received only a handful of coins, but she never skipped the contribution, even when it meant eating ramen noodles for dinner. Your futures are non-negotiable, she told the twins as she dropped quarters into the slot, even though they were far too young to understand. The choice between necessities became routine. One particularly cold November evening, Naomi stood in a department store contemplating 2 impossible options: new law school application materials or the winter coat her threadbare jacket could no longer replace. The coat would keep her warm during the long walks to save bus fare. The application would move her one step closer to her long-term goals. She chose the application materials, adding an extra sweater beneath her thin jacket instead. Nights of study stretched endlessly, Naomi's eyes burning as she reviewed legal precedents and constitutional amendments. Often she fell asleep at the table, waking with textbook pages stuck to her cheek when one of the twins cried for a middle-of-night feeding. She would nurse or bottle feed while continuing to read, highlighting passages with her free hand. The twins reached their 2nd birthday with a small celebration: cupcakes Rosa baked and 2 stuffed bears Naomi had saved for weeks to purchase. Both boys were walking and beginning to form words, their personalities emerging distinctly. Malcolm, serious and observant, spent hours arranging blocks in precise patterns. Marcus, more outgoing, babbled constantly to anyone who would listen. Their 2nd winter brought crisis. Malcolm developed a persistent cough that worsened despite over-the-counter medicines and steam treatments. When his fever spiked to 104 degrees and his breathing became labored, Naomi rushed him to the emergency room, Marcus balanced on her other hip. The public hospital emergency department was overcrowded and understaffed. After registering, Naomi sat for 4 hours on a hard plastic chair, Malcolm burning against her chest while Marcus played listlessly on the dirty floor with keys and discarded magazine pages. "He needs to be seen now," Naomi insisted to the harried nurse at the desk. "He can barely breathe." "Everyone here needs to be seen, ma'am," came the tired response. "We're doing our best." When Malcolm's lips began taking on a bluish tinge, Naomi abandoned politeness. Standing directly at the nurse's station, she raised her voice. "My son is turning blue! He needs oxygen now." The commotion finally brought Dr. Eleanor Peterson, a young resident with tired eyes and quick hands. One look at Malcolm and she rushed him into a treatment room, barking orders for oxygen and chest x-rays. "Pneumonia," she diagnosed shortly. He needs to be admitted immediately. The hospital bureaucracy presented its next challenge. Your insurance doesn't fully cover inpatient care, the admissions clerk explained without making eye contact. We'll need a deposit of $8,000. Naomi's knees nearly buckled. I don't have that kind of money, but he needs treatment. You can't turn him away. We don't turn away emergency cases, but there's paperwork for hardship exceptions, payment plans. The clerk pushed forms across the counter. Dr. Peterson appeared beside Naomi, still in her scrubs. This child needs admission now. Start the paperwork for the Pediatric Foundation coverage. I'll sign as the referring physician. Later, as Malcolm slept in the hospital crib, an oxygen mask dwarfing his tiny face, Dr. Peterson explained, the foundation covers children whose families fall into the insurance gap. You're not the first single mother in this situation, and sadly, won't be the last. For 5 nights, Naomi slept in the uncomfortable chair beside Malcolm's hospital bed, Marcus staying with Rosa. During Malcolm's brief periods of peaceful sleep, she studied, preparing for the law school entrance exam she would take the following month. Dr. Peterson found her on the final night surrounded by practice tests. You're studying law? She asked, checking Malcolm's vitals. I was in law school when I got pregnant, Naomi explained. I'm going back to finish, eventually. The doctor nodded approvingly. What specialty? Naomi looked at Malcolm, his breathing finally easy after days of struggle. Originally corporate law, but after this experience, maybe health law. No family should have to choose between rent and medicine or beg for care their child desperately needs. The system is broken, Dr. Peterson agreed. Then I'll help fix it, Naomi replied, a new determination coloring her voice. One day, I'll change how healthcare works for families like mine. While watching Malcolm finally sleeping without fever, Naomi didn't know that this same crisis that nearly destroyed her family would be the catalyst for creating, years later, the Clark Medical Access Foundation, which would provide free medical assistance to over 1 million children from low-income families. 3 years of relentless work had passed since Malcolm's pneumonia scare. Naomi sat at her kitchen table, the morning light streaming through windows she'd finally been able to replace last winter. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope that had arrived from New York University School of Law. The twins, now 5 years old, looked up from their picture books, sensing their mother's tension. What does it say, Mama? Marcus asked, always the first to speak. Naomi read the letter silently, tears forming in her eyes. She'd done it. After 3 years as a paralegal, saving every possible penny and studying through countless nights, she'd been readmitted to complete her law degree. We're going back, she whispered, pulling both boys into a tight embrace. Mama's going back to law school. Why are you crying if it's good news? Malcolm asked, his analytical mind already working to understand the contradiction. Sometimes happiness makes you cry too, she explained, wiping her eyes. These are good tears. The following week, Naomi organized Mr. Morales' filing system with renewed purpose. The small immigration law office had become her training ground, its cluttered rooms filled with case files that told stories of struggle and perseverance not unlike her own. As she methodically sorted through a particularly disorganized stack of documents, her eye caught an error in a contract that had been overlooked. Mr. Morales, she called, rushing into his office with the papers. I think I found something important in the Rodriguez case. The elderly lawyer adjusted his reading glasses, examining where she pointed. His eyes widened. Dios mío, you're right. This clause contradicts the terms on page 3. How did everyone miss this? I've been studying contract law for my readmission, Naomi explained. This invalidates their entire claim against your client. Mr. Morales smiled broadly. Naomi, you have a natural eye for this work. Most paralegals just file papers. You actually understand the law. Her expanding responsibilities at the office coincided with another development. The twins' kindergarten teacher requested a meeting, causing Naomi immediate anxiety. She rearranged her schedule, prepared to defend her children against whatever issues had arisen. "Ms. Clark," the teacher began when Naomi arrived, clutching her purse nervously, "I wanted to discuss Malcolm and Marcus's academic progress." "Is there a problem?" Naomi asked, her spine stiffening. The teacher smiled warmly. "Quite the opposite. Your sons are reading at a fourth-grade level. Their mathematical abilities are equally advanced. I've rarely seen children this intellectually developed at 5 years old." That evening, Naomi observed her sons with renewed awareness. Malcolm sat cross-legged on the floor, meticulously assembling a puzzle designed for children twice his age, his small fingers placing each piece with deliberate precision. Across the room, Marcus had created an elaborate fort from blankets and chairs, weaving a complex narrative about explorers and hidden treasures to entertain his more reserved brother. "And then the brave explorers found the ancient map," Marcus was saying, his vocabulary remarkably sophisticated for a 5-year-old. "But they had to decipher the mysterious symbols." "Decipher means to figure out a code," Malcolm added without looking up from his puzzle. Their abilities weren't accidental. Despite her exhausting schedule, Naomi had read to them every night since they were infants, checked out educational videos from the library, and played mathematical games during bath time. When they'd shown early interest in reading, she'd spent precious dollars on phonics workbooks instead of replacing her worn shoes. Her careful investment in their development was bearing fruit, but she knew the public school system might not challenge them adequately. The thought of private school tuition seemed an impossible dream, until a new case landed on her desk. Mrs. Rivera, a single mother of 3, had received an eviction notice from her landlord. A subsidiary company Naomi discovered was owned by Whitmore Holdings. The realization sent ice through her veins, followed immediately by burning determination. For 3 nights straight after putting the twins to bed, Naomi researched housing regulations, tenant rights, and previous cases involving the property management company. She discovered multiple violations of city housing codes and evidence of discriminatory practices. Armed with this knowledge, she accompanied Mr. Morales to housing court, where a corporate attorney in an expensive suit barely glanced at them as they entered. "Mr. Morales," the corporate lawyer acknowledged with a dismissive nod, "I think we can make this quick. Your client is 3 weeks behind on rent and has received proper notice." "Actually," Naomi interjected, opening a meticulously organized folder, "our client has documentation of maintenance requests that were repeatedly ignored, violating Section 235B of New York property law regarding warranty of habitability." The lawyer looked at her properly for the first time, surprise evident in his expression. "And you are?" "Naomi Clark, Mr. Morales' paralegal." What followed was a masterclass in negotiation. Naomi, speaking with a confidence that belied her position, presented evidence of broken heating systems, mold issues, and failure to provide legally mandated services. When the corporate attorney attempted to dismiss these as irrelevant, she produced photographs, dated maintenance requests, and documentation of similar complaints from other tenants. Additionally, she concluded, "We've prepared documentation of what appears to be a pattern of targeting single-parent households for eviction, which could constitute discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. My client accepts the agreement under our conditions, or we can continue and publicly expose how Whitmore Holdings systematically violates tenants' rights." The mention of potential publicity visibly affected the corporate attorney. By the end of the hearing, Mrs. Rivera had received a payment plan, commitments for all repairs, and a reduced rent for the months she'd lived with substandard conditions. Back at the office, Mr. Morales was effusive. "In 20 years of practicing law, I've never seen anyone with such natural talent for negotiation. You knew exactly when to push and when to compromise." 2 days later, Naomi received a call from Lawrence Bennett, a respected corporate attorney whose office was in downtown Manhattan. "Salvador Morales suggested I speak with you," he explained. "I need a skilled paralegal who understands contract law and isn't afraid of complex cases. Would you be interested in interviewing?" The interview took place in a sleek office overlooking the financial district, worlds away from Mr. Morales's cluttered space in the Bronx. Lawrence Bennett was direct and business-focused. "What do you know about mergers and acquisitions?" he asked after reviewing her resume. "I understand the basic legal framework," Naomi replied honestly. "But more importantly, I know how to identify inconsistencies in complex documents and recognize when language is deliberately obfuscating underlying issues." Bennett seemed impressed. "The salary is double what you're making now, with potential bonuses for successful deals. The hours can be demanding, but I understand you're also returning to law school?" Naomi nodded. "Part-time evening program at NYU. I've arranged childcare for my sons." 2 weeks later, Naomi sat in her first law school class in nearly 6 years. The lecture hall was filled with students fresh from undergraduate studies, their designer bags and casual confidence highlighting the difference in their circumstances. She was the only mother in the room, her notebook more precious than their laptops because every page represented hours of planning and sacrifice. While her classmates discussed weekend plans after the lecture, Naomi rushed to the subway, heading to the twins' school where they were taking entrance exams for a program for gifted children. She arrived just as they finished, both boys looking simultaneously tired and excited. "It was really hard, Mama," Marcus reported, "but I knew all the words in the reading part." "The math problems were interesting," Malcolm added more thoughtfully. "They wanted us to explain how we got our answers, not just write them down." 3 days later, the acceptance letter arrived. "We are pleased to offer Malcolm and Marcus Clark full scholarships to our accelerated learning program for exceptionally gifted children," Naomi read aloud, her voice breaking with pride. That weekend, after the twins were asleep, Naomi took the subway to Manhattan. She stood across the street from the imposing glass and steel Whitmore Holdings building, watching employees entering and exiting. The company that had once seemed an untouchable monolith now appeared simply as what it was, a business run by people who made choices, some ethical, some not. "One day," she whispered to herself, "you'll know my name very well." While observing the glass and steel tower of Whitmore Holdings reflecting the Manhattan sunset, Naomi didn't imagine that in less than a decade she would be signing documents to purchase the neighboring building, strategically blocking the expansion that Grant so desperately wanted. Naomi stood outside the Whitmore Holdings building for several minutes longer, memorizing its contours as the sun set behind it. She wasn't there as a spectator, but as a strategist, mentally mapping the terrain of her future conquests. With her law school readmission secured and the twins enrolled in their gifted program, it was time to build the foundation for everything that would follow. 3 years passed in a blur of motion and progress. The twins turned 8, growing from precocious kindergartners into academically exceptional third graders. Their identical faces had developed subtle differences that reflected their diverging personalities. Malcolm's expression often contemplative and focused, while Marcus carried himself with natural charisma that drew people to him instantly. Naomi completed her law degree with honors, juggling full-time work at Bennett Legal with evening classes and motherhood. The graduation ceremony was held on a brilliant spring morning, the twins dressed in matching suits, watching proudly as their mother accepted her diploma. "That's our mom," Marcus whispered loudly enough for nearby attendees to hear, pointing excitedly as Naomi crossed the stage. "Dr. Juris," Malcolm corrected seriously. "That's what the degree is called." 1 week after graduation, Naomi received 3 job offers. She accepted a position with Peters & Schumann, a mid-sized firm specializing in corporate law with a growing reputation for taking on complex cases. Her starting salary was triple what she'd made as a paralegal, enabling her to move the family from their Bronx apartment to a decent 3-bedroom in Brooklyn. On her first day, Naomi arranged a small collection of framed photographs on her desk, the twins at their science fair, the 3 of them at her law school graduation, and a candid shot Rosa had taken of the boys reading together. These images were more than decoration. They were visible reminders of why she pushed herself beyond normal limits. "Clark, we need you in the conference room," called Philip Schumann, one of the founding partners, during her second week. "The Hamilton merger has complications." Naomi entered the sleek conference room where 6 male attorneys sat around a polished table discussing strategy. When she offered a suggestion regarding a contractual clause, the senior partner, Walter Peters, continued speaking as though she hadn't uttered a word. Minutes later, when another attorney proposed the same idea, Peters nodded enthusiastically. "Excellent point, David." Rather than retreat into silence, Naomi cleared her throat. "I believe that was the suggestion I made earlier, Mr. Peters. I'd be happy to elaborate on the legal precedents supporting this approach if that would be helpful." The room fell silent, several men shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. Peters stared at her for a long moment before nodding curtly. "Proceed, Ms. Clark." By the meeting's end, she had established herself as someone who would not be casually dismissed. It was a pattern she would repeat throughout the firm, speaking with precision and confidence, backing assertions with meticulous research, and refusing to be overlooked. At home, the family established new routines in their Brooklyn apartment. The kitchen table became command central, hosting not only meals but homework sessions and family planning. One evening, Naomi hung a large whiteboard on the wall, writing "Clark Family 5-Year Plan" across the top. "What's this for, Mom?" Malcolm asked, examining the board with curiosity. "This is where we map our future," Naomi explained, uncapping a marker. At the very top, she wrote, "Clark Legal, 2018, in bold letters. "What's Clark Legal?" Marcus questioned, leaning forward in his chair. "That's the law firm I'm going to build," she answered with quiet confidence. "My own company where I make the rules and help people who need it most." "Will we work there too?" Malcolm asked seriously. Naomi smiled, touching his cheek gently. "If you want to. Or you might build something entirely different. That's what this plan is about, creating possibilities." The twins contributed their own goals to the board. Malcolm wanted to build computers that could think like humans, while Marcus planned to become president, or maybe an astronaut first, then president. 6 months into her position at Peters & Schumann, Naomi faced her first major client meeting. The conference room filled with executives from a technology startup seeking legal guidance for their initial public offering. As Walter Peters introduced the firm's team, one client raised an eyebrow at Naomi's inclusion. "Is the junior associate handling administrative matters?" he asked, glancing at his colleagues with an amused expression. Before Peters could respond, Naomi addressed the comment directly. "I'll be leading the securities compliance portion of your IPO, Mr. Harrington. My background includes specialized work in regulatory frameworks for technology companies." The client looked skeptical. "You seem rather new." "Perhaps I didn't have the privilege of being born into connections and opportunities," Naomi replied evenly, maintaining eye contact. "But that means I've worked twice as hard to be sitting at this table. Your company will benefit from that dedication." By the meeting's end, Harrington was directing his technical questions specifically to Naomi, impressed by her thorough understanding of both the legal and technological aspects of his business. Her reputation within the firm grew steadily, particularly after she identified a critical tax liability issue that saved a major client millions in potential penalties. Partners began requesting her specifically for complex cases, appreciating her thoroughness and strategic thinking. One morning, while reviewing case assignments, Naomi froze at the sight of a familiar name. Whitmore Holdings was listed as a party in a major merger deal the firm had just accepted. Her heart raced as she scrolled through the preliminary documents, memories flooding back with painful clarity. Without hesitation, she walked directly to Philip Schumann's office. "I'd like to work on the Whitmore Holdings merger," she stated without preamble. Schumann looked up from his computer, surprised. "That's a senior-level case, Clark. We typically assign those to partners." "I have specialized knowledge of real estate holding companies and their acquisition strategies," she replied, carefully omitting the personal connection. "I believe I could add significant value to our approach." After a moment's consideration, Schumann nodded. We'll pair you with Richardson. Don't make me regret this decision." For the next 3 weeks, Naomi spent every evening after the twins' bedtime studying Whitmore Holdings' portfolio, structure, and history. She knew things about the company that no outside attorney could possibly know. Grant's acquisition strategies, his blind spots, the projects he considered his greatest achievements, and the failures he'd tried to bury. When the negotiation meeting arrived, Naomi sat quietly beside Richardson as Whitmore executives laid out their terms. She waited for precisely the right moment before speaking. "Your valuation assumes the Silverline project assets are fully integrated," she noted calmly, referring to a failed development that had been quietly shelved years earlier, information known only to insiders. "Our assessment suggests those assets are significantly compromised." The lead Whitmore executive stared at her, momentarily speechless. "How do you know about Silverline?" "That project was internal." "We conduct thorough due diligence," Naomi replied smoothly. "The question remains, should we adjust the valuation to reflect those actual assets, or would you prefer to remove them entirely from the agreement?" The negotiation shifted dramatically in their client's favor after that moment. By day's end, they'd secured terms that saved their client nearly $40 million. "How did you know about those vulnerabilities?" Richardson asked as they returned to the office. "That information wasn't in any public filing." Naomi offered a measured smile. "Let's just say I have a particular interest in Whitmore Holdings." 2 months later, Naomi received her first significant bonus check. The amount, more than she'd earned in entire years at her previous jobs, represented not just financial compensation but validation of her strategic approach. That weekend, she took the twins to view an apartment in a Dorman building in a better part of Brooklyn, a space with large windows, modern appliances, and most importantly, separate bedrooms for the boys who were beginning to need their own space. As Malcolm and Marcus raced through the empty rooms, excitedly claiming territories and planning how they'd arrange their possessions, Naomi stood by the window, watching the Manhattan skyline in the distance. From this new vantage point, the Whitmore Holdings building was just one among many, significant but no longer intimidating. While unpacking boxes in her new Brooklyn apartment, Naomi carefully stored the Moonlight Lounge waitress uniform in a special box, not knowing that one day that piece would be displayed in a showcase in her penthouse office as a reminder of the journey traveled until becoming the billionaire CEO of the country's largest independent law firm. The cardboard box containing Naomi's waitress uniform sat untouched at the back of her closet as she carefully arranged her newly purchased blazers and pencil skirts in her Brooklyn apartment. She hadn't opened it in years, but couldn't bring herself to discard it either. That uniform represented the starting point of her journey, a tangible reminder of how far she'd come and how much further she intended to go. 3 years after joining Peters and Schumann, Naomi stood outside the senior partners' conference room, straightening her tailored navy suit jacket. Inside, the partnership committee was voting on this year's promotions. At 34, she would be the youngest junior partner in the firm's history if approved and the first black woman to achieve the position. The door opened and Walter Peters gestured for her to enter. 12 senior attorneys sat around the gleaming mahogany table, expressions carefully neutral. "Ms. Clark," Peters began, his voice formal, "the committee has reviewed your case files, client acquisition records, and billable hours." He paused, a slight smile finally breaking through his professional demeanor. "I've never seen anyone get this far this fast. Welcome to the partnership." Later that evening, Naomi uncorked a bottle of champagne, pouring a glass for herself and sparkling cider for the twins, now 11 years old and increasingly aware of their mother's accomplishments. "To the newest junior partner at Peters and Schumann," she toasted, raising her glass. "What exactly does a partner do that's different?" Malcolm asked, his analytical mind always seeking to understand systems and hierarchies. "It means I have ownership in the firm now," Naomi explained. "I'll make decisions about which cases we take, help shape the company's direction, and earn a percentage of our profits instead of just a salary." "Does it mean you'll work even more hours?" Marcus asked, his perceptive gaze fixed on her face. Naomi smiled gently. "Maybe initially, but it also means I can choose my cases more selectively, and the increased income will create more opportunities for all of us." The twins exchanged glances, their silent communication system Naomi had never fully decoded. Malcolm nodded slightly, and Marcus turned back to her. "We got our acceptance letters today," he announced. Naomi nearly spilled her champagne. "Already?" They weren't supposed to decide for another 2 weeks. Malcolm retrieved 2 identical envelopes from his backpack. "Columbia University's summer program for exceptional young scholars cordially invites you to participate in our 6-week academic intensive," he read aloud. Pride swelled in Naomi's chest. The program at Columbia was incredibly selective, typically accepting high school students, not 11-year-olds. Yet here were her boys, already developing into the exceptional men she'd always known they would become. Malcolm had shown remarkable aptitude for mathematics and computer science, already developing simple algorithms that had impressed his instructors. His bedroom was filled with books on artificial intelligence and quantum computing, subjects he discussed with casual fluency that sometimes left even Naomi struggling to follow. Marcus, equally brilliant but in different domains, had recently been elected president of the student council, the youngest in the school's history. His natural leadership abilities and persuasive speaking skills had teachers predicting a future in politics or international diplomacy. Summer arrived, bringing new rhythms to the Clark household. While the twins attended their program at Columbia, guided by graduate student mentors and university professors, Naomi found herself assigned to a high-profile intellectual property case against Whitmore Holdings. The file landed on her desk with a post-it note from Walter Peters. "This needs your special touch. Client claims Whitmore used their architectural designs without permission for a new development in Brooklyn." Naomi's heart raced as she opened the folder. This wasn't just another case. This was an opportunity to directly challenge Grant's company, legitimately, professionally, and devastatingly. For the next month, she led the discovery process with methodical precision. As her team dug deeper into Whitmore Holdings' business practices, they uncovered something unexpected: a pattern of property acquisitions in predominantly black neighborhoods of Brooklyn, using tactics that appeared designed to artificially depress property values before purchase. Naomi worked late into the night, reviewing internal emails and memoranda obtained through discovery. One particular message from a Whitmore executive referred to homeowners in Bedford-Stuyvesant as easy targets who don't understand the true value of their properties. The evidence formed a disturbing picture of systematic exploitation of communities of color, communities like the one where Naomi had struggled to raise her sons during those early years. When the Whitmore legal team requested a settlement conference, Naomi entered the negotiation room with quiet confidence. 5 attorneys from Whitmore's side sat across the table, their expressions betraying mild surprise at seeing a black woman leading the opposition. "Our client is prepared to offer $3 million to settle all claims, with standard non-disclosure provisions," their lead counsel began, sliding a document across the table. Naomi didn't even glance at the offer. "That's insufficient. The alleged infringement applies to only one building design." "This isn't just about the design infringement," Naomi interrupted, opening her presentation folder. "During discovery, we identified what appears to be a pattern of discriminatory acquisition practices targeting minority communities." The color drained from the lead attorney's face. "That's beyond the scope of this case." "Perhaps," Naomi conceded, "but it's certainly within the scope of a federal housing discrimination lawsuit and media scrutiny. My client accepts the agreement under our conditions, or we continue and publicly expose how Whitmore Holdings systematically violates tenants' rights." By day's end, Whitmore Holdings had agreed to a $50 million settlement that included not only compensation for the design infringement, but also commitments to fund community development projects in the affected neighborhoods. Back at the firm, her colleagues raised glasses in celebration. "To the woman who managed to extract $50 million from the mighty Whitmore Holdings," toasted one of the senior partners. "Whatever secret weapon you're wielding against them, keep it loaded." If they only knew, Naomi thought, smiling politely as she sipped her champagne. 2 weeks later, she received her first 7-figure bonus check. Staring at the number, Naomi momentarily lost her composure, tears blurring her vision as she remembered counting coins at her kitchen table to decide between food and bus fare. The next day, she contacted a real estate agent. "I'm interested in properties on Park Avenue," she explained, specifically in the Carnegie Hill area. The agent seemed skeptical until Naomi mentioned her price range. 3 days later, she toured a 3-bedroom apartment in a pre-war building with a doorman, marble lobby, and views of Central Park. It was in the same building where Grant had maintained a pied-à-terre, the building he'd once told her was not for people like you. "I'll take it," Naomi told the surprised agent after walking through the empty rooms. "We can close as soon as the paperwork is ready." That evening, Naomi and the twins entered their new apartment, the boys racing from room to room, exclaiming over the high ceilings, the park views, and the sheer space compared to their Brooklyn home. "We can see the whole park from here," Marcus called from one of the bedroom windows. "The building has a gym and a library," Malcolm added, having already memorized the amenities list. Later, after a celebration dinner of takeout Chinese food eaten picnic style on the empty living room floor, Naomi explained her vision to her sons. "This money isn't just for us," she said seriously, watching their expressions. "It's the beginning of something bigger, a foundation for building the kind of security and influence that can create real change." "Like helping other single moms?" Marcus suggested. Naomi nodded. "And changing the systems that make their lives unnecessarily difficult." Malcolm, ever practical, asked, "Is that why we moved here? To be closer to the people with power?" "Partly," Naomi admitted. "In this world, proximity matters, but also to remind ourselves that no spaces are off-limits to us anymore." The next morning, a courier delivered an invitation to an international legal conference in London, an exclusive gathering of top corporate attorneys and business leaders from around the world. The handwritten note from the organizer mentioned Naomi's innovative approach to corporate responsibility in merger negotiations. As she held the heavy cardstock invitation, Naomi whispered to herself, "It's time to think bigger." While looking out the window of her new Park Avenue apartment, Naomi didn't know that the London conference would be the catalyst for creating Clark Legal Enterprises, the legal empire that, in just 5 years, would be valued at $1 billion and become Grant Whitmore's competitive nightmare. The London invitation shimmered in Naomi's hand as she stood by her Park Avenue window, its embossed lettering catching the afternoon light. She'd come to understand that in the world of power, such invitations weren't merely social. They were currency, doors opening to rooms where real influence resided. This particular door might lead to possibilities she had only begun to imagine. 3 weeks later, Naomi stepped into the grand ballroom of the Savoy, where the International Corporate Law Summit gathered the most influential legal minds from across the globe. The elegant space hummed with conversations in multiple languages, deals being struck between champagne sips and casual handshakes. "Ms. Clark, Naomi Clark from Peters and Schumann." A woman with striking silver hair approached, her accent placing her somewhere in the Asian Pacific. "Yes, that's me," Naomi confirmed, extending her hand. "Dr. Eliza Chen, your reputation precedes you. Your work on the Whitmore Holdings settlement was impressive." The woman's appraising gaze reminded Naomi of a chess master evaluating a promising opponent. Naomi recognized the name immediately. Dr. Eliza Chen had revolutionized the pharmaceutical industry with breakthrough patents in immunotherapy. The Chen Medical Group was valued at over $20 billion, with offices in 17 countries. "I'm honored you're familiar with my work, Dr. Chen." Chen gestured toward a quieter corner. Perhaps we could continue this conversation over tea tomorrow? I have a proposition that might interest you. The following afternoon, seated in a private room at the Ritz-Carlton, Naomi listened as Dr. Chen outlined a vision that seemed extracted from her own dreams. I'm establishing a new legal division within the Chen Group, she explained, her manicured fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. I need someone who understands both corporate structures and ethical boundaries, a combination surprisingly rare in our world. There are many established attorneys with deeper experience, Naomi pointed out. Chen's smile was knowing. Experience can be measured in different ways. I've been watching your career trajectory. You've accomplished more in 3 years than most do in 15. She set down her cup with deliberate precision. I'm looking for someone who understands both sides of power, someone who knows what it means to be without it, and how to wield it responsibly when acquired. What exactly are you proposing? Financing, resources, connections. Chen's eyes locked with Naomi's. To establish your own firm with complete autonomy. Naomi's breath caught. Why me? Because you see what others miss. Because you've transformed obstacles into stepping stones. Chen leaned forward slightly. And because I recognize the hunger in your eyes. It's the same one I had at your age. 2 weeks after returning to New York, Naomi received a formal proposal from the Chen Group. Seed funding of $50 million to establish a new corporate law practice, with Naomi retaining 70% ownership and complete operational control. That same week, the twins received their acceptance letters to Phillips Academy Andover, one of the most prestigious preparatory schools in the country. At 13, both had qualified for full merit scholarships, an achievement that filled Naomi with overwhelming pride and bittersweet recognition that they would soon be leaving home. Will you be okay without us, Mom? Marcus asked as they packed their trunks for the fall semester. Naomi folded his sweaters with careful precision. I'll miss you both terribly, but this is exactly what we've been working toward. Malcolm looked up from organizing his books alphabetically. The statistical probability of our succeeding at an institution like Andover is significantly enhanced by the foundation you've provided us. Naomi laughed, pulling him into a hug. That's Malcolm speak for thank you, isn't it? The day she dropped them at Andover's sprawling campus was one of the most difficult of her life. After helping them arrange their dormitory room, checking and double-checking that they had everything they needed, the moment of departure arrived with brutal finality. We'll call every Sunday, Marcus promised, his usual confidence momentarily wavering as he hugged her tightly. And Wednesday evenings after study hall, Malcolm added precisely. We're going to make you proud, Mom, Marcus whispered. Naomi fought back tears. You already have, every single day. Watching their figures grow smaller in her rearview mirror, Naomi felt a strange mixture of loss and liberation. For the first time in 13 years, her daily schedule would not revolve around the twins' needs. The emptiness was painful, but it created space for the next phase of her plan. 1 week later, Naomi signed the lease for the first Clark Legal Enterprises office, a modest floor in a midtown Manhattan building. Standing alone in the empty space, she envisioned what it would become. Conference rooms where strategies would be crafted, offices filled with attorneys who shared her vision, a firm that would redefine what corporate law could accomplish. Her first 10 hires were carefully selected not only for their legal acumen but for their alignment with her guiding principles. During their initial meeting, gathered around a makeshift conference table of rental furniture, Naomi articulated her vision. We're going to change the rules of the game, she told them, looking at each face in turn. Corporate law has traditionally served only corporate interests. We'll demonstrate that ethical practice and profitability aren't mutually exclusive. At night, after long days establishing her firm's infrastructure, Naomi dedicated hours to studying Whitmore Holdings' portfolio in meticulous detail. She identified a perfect target, a small real estate management subsidiary that Grant had acquired 5 years ago and subsequently neglected, a company with undervalued assets and untapped potential. Creating an acquisition vehicle called Nexus Ventures, she instructed her team to prepare an offer through this shell company. "They cannot know I'm behind this," she emphasized during a strategy session. "Not yet." When the proposal was ready, Naomi reviewed every detail before authorizing its submission. "This is just stage 1, she told her lead attorney, signing the documents with controlled precision. The acquisition proceeded smoothly. The subsidiary was small enough not to require Grant's personal attention, handled instead by mid-level executives who saw only a standard business transaction. For $100 million, leveraged with Chen's investment and strategic loans, Naomi acquired her first piece of the Whitmore empire. What followed was a masterclass in corporate restructuring. Naomi worked relentlessly, often remaining at the office until dawn, implementing changes that transformed the underperforming subsidiary into a streamlined, profitable operation. Properties were renovated, management systems modernized, and tenant relations completely overhauled. Within 6 months, the subsidiary's value had increased by 60%. When Naomi received an unsolicited offer from a West Coast investment group, she recognized the perfect exit opportunity. The sale netted a $100 million profit, effectively doubling her initial investment. The transaction made headlines in financial publications. Nexus Ventures scores 100% return on real estate play, and mystery firm flips former, Whitmore Holdings, subsidiary for impressive gain. Naomi preserved these clippings in a leather portfolio, a tangible record of her first strategic victory. In her new, larger office, the firm had already expanded to occupy 3 floors. She stood by the window overlooking Manhattan, her gaze automatically finding the Whitmore Tower among the skyline. "Next step," she whispered to herself, marking the building in her mental map. What Grant Whitmore didn't yet understand, couldn't possibly comprehend, was that Naomi Clark had spent 13 years studying his empire from the outside, identifying its weaknesses, understanding its structures better perhaps than he did himself. The acquisition was merely the opening move in a much larger strategy. While observing Manhattan from her new office, Naomi didn't know that in just 2 years Clark Legal Enterprises would be valued at more than $1 billion, and that Grant Whitmore, unaware of the identity of the woman who was systematically acquiring parts of his empire, was already beginning to feel the noose tightening. While Grant Whitmore remained oblivious to the identity of his new competitor, Naomi's strategic acquisition had laid the groundwork for something far more ambitious. The $100 million profit from the Whitmore Holdings subsidiary was merely the first domino in a sequence she had planned for years. As she turned away from the Manhattan skyline visible from her office window, Naomi knew the real game was just beginning. 5 years passed with breathtaking speed. The Clark Legal Enterprises that had begun in a modest single-floor office now occupied a gleaming 50-story skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, the distinctive CLE logo illuminating the skyline. Inside the building, over 2,000 employees operated with precision across practice areas ranging from mergers and acquisitions to international trade law. What had begun as Naomi's vision had transformed into a global powerhouse with satellite offices in Tokyo, London, São Paulo, and Dubai. At 36, Naomi Clark had become a fixture on the covers of business magazines and a regular entry on lists of America's most powerful women. Forbes had recently estimated her personal net worth at $3.2 billion, placing her solidly among the country's self-made billionaires, a far cry from the pregnant waitress counting tips at the Moonlight Lounge. "Ms. Clark, your 10 o'clock video conference is ready," announced her executive assistant through the intercom. "And the twins called while you were in your strategy meeting. They said they'll arrive in time for tonight's event." Naomi smiled at the mention of Malcolm and Marcus. Now 15, the boys were completing their final year at Andover, both having been accepted early to Yale. They had blossomed into extraordinary young men, each brilliant in his own distinct way. Malcolm, with his analytical mind and quiet intensity, had developed an artificial intelligence algorithm that had attracted attention from MIT's computer science department. He'd spent his summer at a Silicon Valley incubator, surrounded by engineers 3 times his age who treated him as an equal. Marcus, whose natural charisma and eloquence mirrored the father he'd never met, had recently won a national oratory competition. He'd also founded an organization that helped underprivileged youth prepare for elite university admissions, already demonstrating the social conscience that Naomi had carefully nurtured in both boys. Naomi turned her attention to the documents awaiting her signature, the final paperwork establishing the Clark Justice Foundation with an initial endowment of $300 million. The foundation would focus on providing higher education funding for children of single mothers, a mission deeply personal to her. Ironically, much of the endowment came from profits generated by the hostile acquisition of another Whitmore Holdings subsidiary that Grant had neglected in recent years. "The Singapore investors are confirmed for 2 p.m., her assistant reminded her through the intercom, "and the Waldorf Astoria Gala team called to confirm your keynote address at tonight's annual Business Leaders Forum opening." Naomi acknowledged the reminder, her thoughts momentarily drifting to the gala. She'd accepted the invitation to speak months ago, viewing it as another opportunity to raise her profile among the business elite. What she hadn't known when accepting was that Grant Whitmore would also be attending, scheduled to speak on the same panel representing the real estate sector. The organizers, unaware of their history, had created the perfect stage for a confrontation 15 years in the making. Her private elevator pinged as it reached the penthouse floor. Naomi crossed her office to the floor-to-ceiling windows, surveying the city that had once seemed so hostile and impenetrable. Now, 3 of the buildings visible from her vantage point belonged to Clark Legal Enterprises, including one that Grant had desperately tried to acquire last year. The path to this moment had not been easy. After the birth of the twins, she'd completed her paralegal certification while working days and studying nights, Rosa watching the babies. With single-minded determination, she'd saved enough to return to law school 3 years later, graduating with honors and immediately securing a position at a mid-sized firm. Her first major opportunity came when she identified a critical flaw in a merger contract between 2 technology companies, saving her client millions. Within 5 years, she'd become partner. In 7, she'd opened her own practice. In 10, Forbes had mentioned her as one of the most influential women in American business. The afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and conference calls. At 4:30, her styling team arrived to prepare her for the evening's gala. As they adjusted the custom Carolina Herrera gown she would wear, Naomi received confirmation that she'd been included in the Wall Street Journal's list of the 50 most powerful women in America. Simultaneously, Yale's dean requested a meeting to discuss the twins' early admission, both having achieved perfect scores on their standardized tests. In her expansive closet, beside rows of Louboutins and Manolos she could now purchase without hesitation, Naomi kept a sealed preservation box containing her Moonlight Lounge uniform and Grant's original check, now framed. Not as painful reminders, but as testaments to her journey. At 7 o'clock, the Clark Legal Enterprises limousine pulled up to the Waldorf Astoria. Naomi stepped out, resplendent in her sapphire blue gown, complemented by a diamond necklace she'd purchased for herself after closing her first billion-dollar deal. Behind her, Malcolm and Marcus emerged, tall and elegantly dressed in perfectly tailored tuxedos. At 15, they carried the unmistakable features of the father they'd never known, the same light green eyes that had once looked upon their mother with contempt. "Nervous?" Marcus asked, adjusting his bow tie with practiced ease. "Never," Naomi replied with a confident smile. "We've built all of this without needing anyone. Tonight is just another confirmation." As they walked the red carpet, photographers called her name, flashbulbs illuminating their path. Business journalists shouted questions about the Clark Justice Foundation's latest initiatives. Naomi answered with practiced poise, the twins flanking her like protective sentinels. Inside the grand ballroom, the elite of American business mingled over champagne and carefully crafted hors d'oeuvres. CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, tech billionaires, and financial titans greeted Naomi with the deference reserved for true power players. Many sought introductions to Malcolm and Marcus, already recognizing the next generation of potential influence. Across the room, Grant Whitmore, now 43, adjusted his tuxedo jacket while checking his speech notes. After 2 divorces and a series of personal scandals, he maintained his position as CEO of Whitmore Holdings following his father's death, though the company had lost significant market share to more innovative competitors in recent years. He had no idea that the woman he'd once dismissed as just a black girl from a poor neighborhood was about to enter his sphere again. This time, from a position of vastly superior power. A hush fell over the crowd as the master of ceremonies approached the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. It is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker this evening. Recently elected president of the National Corporate Attorneys Association and founder of the Clark Justice Foundation, Dr. Naomi Clark has been recognized by the Wall Street Journal as the most influential attorney on the East Coast, with an estimated net worth of $3.2 billion. Grant absent-mindedly checked emails on his phone as the introduction continued, paying little attention until Naomi took the stage. The moment she stepped into the spotlight, commanding and confident, his head snapped up in recognition. 15 years had transformed the frightened young woman he'd thrown out of his office into a magnetic presence whose power was almost palpable. But it was the sight of the 2 teenagers who accompanied her to the stage that drained all color from his face. Tall and poised, the twins exhibited the same light green eyes that Grant saw in his mirror every morning. There could be no doubt. They were his sons. "Some men in this room once told me I didn't belong here," Naomi began, her gaze deliberately sweeping the audience until it locked with Grant's. "But today you applaud while your empires depend on my legal approval." Grant felt his throat constrict as she continued her speech about transforming rejection into fuel to build one of the country's largest legal empires. With each word, the gazes of those present alternated between Naomi and the young men flanking her, Malcolm, analytical and calculating, and Marcus, charismatic and eloquent, discreetly greeting important figures who recognized them. While the cameras flashed and attendees hung on Naomi's every word, Grant Whitmore sat frozen in his chair, 15 years of secrets crumbling in real time as he realized that the empire he'd built might not survive the storm about to break over his head. While the photographer's flashes captured Grant's devastated expression, Naomi didn't know that the true reckoning would come the following morning, when the Whitmore empire would begin to crumble under the weight of secrets she had meticulously collected during 15 years of patient waiting. The crystal chandeliers of the Waldorf Astoria ballroom cast a warm glow over the sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns as New York's business elite mingled before dinner. Grant Whitmore stood near the bar, nursing a scotch while discussing his latest Miami luxury development with a group of investors. At 43, his once youthful features had hardened, lines of stress and indulgence etching themselves around his eyes despite expensive skincare regimens. After 2 high-profile divorces and a string of failed relationships chronicled enthusiastically by tabloids, his personal life was widely known to be a disaster. Yet his fortune of $2.8 billion ensured his continued membership in the elite circles he'd been born into. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats," announced the master of ceremonies. "Dinner will be served shortly." Grant made his way to his assigned table near the front, prime placement reserved for major sponsors. He barely glanced at the evening's program, instead scrolling through emails on his phone while half listening to the introductory remarks. "It is with great honor that we welcome our keynote speaker tonight," the announcer continued. Recently elected president of the National Corporate Attorneys Association and founder of the Clark Justice Foundation, Dr. Naomi Clark was recognized by the Wall Street Journal as the most influential attorney on the East Coast, with an estimated net worth of $3.2 billion. Something about the name sent an unexpected chill down Grant's spine. He looked up sharply as Naomi ascended the stage with practiced grace, her sapphire gown catching the light as she moved. 15 years had transformed the young waitress he'd once known into a woman of commanding presence and undeniable power. But it was the sight of the two teenagers accompanying her that caused him to freeze mid-sip, nearly choking on his drink. Tall and poised in matching tuxedos, the boys exhibited features that Grant recognized instantly. They had his eyes, his jawline, his bearing. There could be no doubt. These were his sons. "Some men in this room once told me I didn't belong here," Naomi began, her voice strong and clear as her gaze swept deliberately across the audience until it found Grant's. "But today you applaud while your empires depend on my legal approval." Grant felt the blood drain from his face as realization crashed over him. She knew he would be here. This was no coincidence. This was a calculated move 15 years in the making. Throughout her speech about ethical business practices and corporate responsibility, Naomi never directly mentioned Grant. Yet her carefully chosen words seemed aimed precisely at him. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, captivated by her eloquence and the power she radiated. "I'd like to introduce Malcolm and Marcus Clark," she said as she concluded, "the brilliant young men who inspire my work at the Clark Justice Foundation." More applause erupted as the twins stepped forward. Grant couldn't tear his eyes away from them. Malcolm, serious and analytical, surveyed the room with calculated precision. Marcus, charismatic and poised, acknowledged the audience with a warm smile that somehow never reached his eyes. Both boys moved with the confidence of those who had never questioned their place in the world, a stark contrast to their mother's early struggles. As the crowd dispersed for the cocktail portion of the evening, Grant desperately tried to make his way toward Naomi, only to find his path blocked by her security detail. "I'm sorry, sir. Dr. Clark is receiving only pre-scheduled guests at this time," stated a stone-faced man in a tailored suit. "She knows me," Grant insisted. "We have history." "I'm aware, Mr. Whitmore," the security guard replied without emotion. "Those are my instructions." For the next hour, Grant watched from across the room as Naomi worked the crowd masterfully, investors and CEOs orbiting around her like planets around a sun. The twins moved through the gathering with equal confidence, engaging effortlessly with Supreme Court justices and tech billionaires as if they'd been born into this world, which, Grant realized with a jolt, they had been, through their mother. It was during a momentary lull in the evening when Grant finally managed to find himself alone with Naomi in a private corridor leading to the secondary reception rooms. Their collision seemed accidental, though he suspected nothing about this evening had been left to chance. "Naomi," he murmured, his voice betraying his shock, "is it really you?" She studied him with the clinical detachment one might use to evaluate a problematic contract. Time had been kind to Naomi. Her face showed the confidence of someone who had earned everything through merit alone. In contrast, Grant's features revealed the signs of stress and sleepless nights with deep lines around his eyes that his expensive suits couldn't distract from. "Grant Whitmore," she responded, her voice controlled and cool. "I imagined our paths would eventually cross. Wall Street is surprisingly small." "Those boys," he began, unable to fully articulate the question burning in his mind. "These are Malcolm and Marcus, your sons, graduated with honors from Andover and accepted to Yale at 15 years old. They have your intelligence, but, thankfully, my integrity," Naomi replied with clinical coldness. As if summoned by an invisible signal, the twins approached. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. The same facial structure, the same jawline that graced business magazines when Grant closed major deals. "Boys, this is Grant Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Holdings," Naomi introduced without mentioning their biological connection. "Grant, these are Malcolm and Marcus Clark." "Clark?" he repeated, stunned. "Naturally. Malcolm responded with a calculated smile. "It's the surname of the woman who raised us." A group of international investors interrupted the moment, surrounding Marcus with evident fascination. "Mr. Clark, your artificial intelligence project that received $50 million in funding, could you explain how it works?" With impressive poise, Marcus began detailing his AI startup that had already attracted Silicon Valley's attention. Grant watched, paralyzed, as the young man who was his exact copy explained advanced technological concepts with the ease of a seasoned industry veteran. "My mother taught me that character can't be bought with money," Marcus stated to the group, casting a meaningful glance toward Grant. "That's why we prefer to build our own legacy rather than inherit a tainted one." The message was crystal clear. They knew exactly who he was and what he had done. The buzz in the ballroom intensified when a Financial Times reporter approached Naomi for an impromptu interview. "Dr. Clark, your foundation just announced the purchase of 3 commercial buildings on Fifth Avenue. Coincidentally, they were properties that Whitmore Holdings had been trying to acquire for months. Was this a deliberate strategy?" Naomi's smile was glacial as she responded, knowing Grant was listening to every word. "Let's just say I have a special interest in acquiring certain assets that others have underestimated. It's a lesson I learned early in life." Grant noticed several gazes now turning toward him. Some attendees were clearly connecting the dots. The teenagers with their distinctive eyes, the palpable tension, the cutting indirect references. When he attempted to approach Malcolm for a private conversation, it was his son who rebuffed him. "Mr. Whitmore, my mother taught me not to waste time with people who couldn't see our value when they had the chance. If you'll excuse me, I have a video conference with our investors in Tokyo." The evening reached its climax during the formal dinner when the Chamber of Commerce president announced a historic partnership between New York City and the Clark Justice Foundation, a $500 million investment to revitalize the very Bronx neighborhood where Naomi had struggled to survive with her newborn twins. As she returned to the stage to formalize the agreement, Naomi finally delivered the bomb that would destroy Grant's carefully constructed reputation. "This project holds special meaning for me. It was in the Bronx that I raised my sons alone after their father, seated in this room now, told me I was just a black girl from a poor neighborhood who didn't deserve to be part of his world." A sepulchral silence fell over the ballroom. Cameras turned toward Grant, who looked as if he'd been physically struck. "I built a legal empire from a silence check I received from Grant Whitmore when he expelled me from his life while pregnant with his sons," she continued, her voice amplified by the microphones. "I transformed his attempt to silence me into the voice that now defends thousands of abandoned women." The photographer's flashes fired incessantly as Grant, stunned, watched 15 years of secrets crumble in real time. While the flashes of photographers captured Grant's devastated expression, Naomi didn't know that the true reckoning would come the following morning, when the Whitmore empire would begin to crumble under the weight of secrets she had meticulously collected during 15 years of patient waiting. The cameras continued to flash as Naomi exited the stage, her revelation hanging in the air like thunder after lightning. Grant sat motionless, his face ashen, as whispers rippled through the Waldorf Astoria ballroom. The twins flanked their mother as she made her way through the crowd, heads held high, not sparing a single glance in Grant's direction. Their exit was dignified, deliberate, and devastatingly final. The following morning arrived with merciless clarity. Grant awoke to his phone vibrating incessantly on his nightstand. 37 missed calls, 62 text messages, and an inbox overflowing with urgent emails. The first headline he saw made his stomach clench. "Billionaire Grant, Whitmore exposed, abandoned mother of his twin sons." He scrolled frantically through others. From Bronx to Billionaire Row, how Naomi Clark overcame abandonment to build an empire. Whitmore Holdings shares plummet 30% after CEO's ethical misconduct revealed. In his 60th floor office at Whitmore Tower, Grant watched helplessly as stock tickers displayed his company's free-falling market value. On a split screen, Clark Legal Enterprises shares surged, creating the ultimate irony. For the first time in history, Naomi's net worth officially surpassed his own. Ironic how the man who called me a bad investment 15 years ago now values less than the black girl from the Bronx he discarded. Naomi commented in a Bloomberg interview playing at high volume in the conference room where Whitmore Holdings board members heatedly debated the company's future. Grant's phone rang. Catherine, his ex-wife, whom he'd married shortly after abandoning Naomi. "I always knew something was wrong with you," she spat without preamble. "Now I understand why our marriage failed and why you never wanted children with me. You already had them and rejected them." In the weeks that followed, Grant watched his social life disintegrate. Invitations were withdrawn, long-standing friendships cooled, and even his private Manhattan club discreetly suggested that, perhaps temporarily, pausing your membership might be best until the situation settles. Desperate to repair the irreparable, Grant sent a formal email to Naomi's office requesting a private meeting with her and the twins. The response came from an associate attorney. "Doctor, Clark appreciates your contact but declines your request. As for young Mr. Malcolm and Mr. Marcus Clark, both have expressed disinterest in establishing any relationship at this time." The formal, distant rejection proved more painful than any confrontation might have been. Grant hired private investigators to learn more about the sons he'd never known. The reports he received only deepened his despair. Both were prodigies in their fields. Malcolm with 3 technology patents registered at 15, and Marcus already accumulating oratory and leadership awards that projected him as a future political figure of note. Without alternatives, Grant appeared uninvited at the annual Clark Justice Foundation benefit gala at the Plaza Hotel, using his remaining influence to secure a ticket. From across the ballroom, he observed Naomi, radiant in an exclusive Valentino gown, surrounded by admirers and powerful allies. The twins circulated through the room with ease, conversing with Supreme Court justices, Fortune 500 CEOs, and celebrities who supported the foundation. When he finally managed to approach them, begging for a chance to know his sons, it was Malcolm who responded with impressive composure. "We spent 15 years without a father, and now have scholarships in our name at Harvard, registered patents, and a foundation that helps single mothers. Your absence taught us more about success than your presence ever could." Marcus completed the rebuff with the same diplomatic tone that had already made him known among his peers. "We don't harbor resentment, Mr. Whitmore. We simply don't have space in our lives for someone who chose not to have space for us in his." As the twins moved away to receive a Social Innovation Award, Grant finally secured a moment alone with Naomi on one of the ballroom's balconies. "Why now, Naomi? Why expose everything after so long?" he asked, his voice betraying his defeat. "It wasn't revenge, Grant," she answered with a serenity that spoke of inner peace. "It was liberation. For years I kept this story not out of shame, but because I was too busy building something that not even you could tear down." "Can I be part of their lives now? Make up for lost time?" he implored. Naomi's gaze contained no hatred, only a refined indifference that hurt more than any contempt. "It's not my decision to make. They're brilliant young men, fully capable of making their own choices, but don't expect them to fill a void you created yourself." When the spotlights dimmed and guests departed, Grant Whitmore remained alone in the lobby, watching through glass doors as Naomi and her sons boarded their limousine heading to the helipad where their private jet awaited for a trip to their foundation's European headquarters in Paris. A hotel employee approached, delivering an envelope. "Dr. Clark asked that this be given to you, sir." Inside was a handwritten letter on Clark Legal Enterprises letterhead. "Thank you for underestimating me. It was the fuel that transformed your rejection into the largest legal empire New York has ever seen. As for our sons, they carry my surname because you chose not to give them yours. I didn't build all this to take revenge on you, Grant, but to prove to myself that your words were wrong. The true victory isn't seeing you lose, but knowing I never needed you to win." Grant watched the private jet with the Clark Enterprises logo disappear into the night sky over Manhattan, carrying the family that could have been his. He returned to his empty Park Avenue apartment, where a call from the Whitmore Holdings board awaited. They had voted for his temporary removal from the presidency until the image crisis is resolved. That night, standing before his penthouse window, Grant Whitmore contemplated Manhattan's skyscrapers, a city where, for the first time, he was no longer one of the most powerful men. The true punishment wasn't the public shame or financial losses, but the irrevocable late understanding of what his arrogance had cost him. An extraordinary woman and 2 exceptional sons who had learned to triumph without needing him. The most poetic justice hadn't come in the form of destruction, but indifference. Naomi Clark hadn't needed to ruin him. She had simply surpassed him in every possible aspect, proving that the black girl from the poor neighborhood he had rejected now inhabited a world to which he no longer had access. While Grant Whitmore's empire crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny, Naomi Clark's jet crossed the Atlantic. In the cabin, Malcolm and Marcus slept peacefully as their mother reviewed documents for the Paris branch opening. For the first time in 15 years, the weight she had carried felt truly lifted. Her victory wasn't in Grant's downfall. It was in rising so far above him that he became irrelevant to her story. In her private cabin, Naomi opened her laptop to review the next day's schedule. An email notification appeared. Yale's president requesting a meeting about special accommodations for the twins' early enrollment. Simultaneously, the Wall Street Journal requested an exclusive interview about her foundation's latest initiative. She closed the laptop with a small smile. The journey that had begun in heartbreak had led to a place far beyond what she could have imagined that night in her tiny Bronx apartment. As the jet soared above the clouds, Naomi Clark finally understood that her greatest accomplishment wasn't becoming a billionaire or building a legal empire. It was showing her sons that integrity and determination could overcome even the cruelest rejection. The true victory wasn't measured in dollars or headlines, but in the knowledge that she had transformed Grant's attempt to erase her into the foundation of a legacy that would outlast them both. If you enjoyed today's video, I'm sure you'll love the next one. Don't waste time. Just click on the screen.